When you hear the word auditor, it is easy to picture someone looking for mistakes, but in incident reporting, the auditor's real job is usually simpler than people think. They are trying to answer a small set of questions that matter for trust. Did you notice the incident in a reasonable way? Did you respond in a controlled way? Did you document what you did? And can you prove it with evidence instead of storytelling? Compliance-ready reporting means you can hand over an incident record and it will stand up to careful reading without needing you to explain every missing piece from memory. For beginners, this can feel intimidating because audits sound formal and legal, but the heart of it is practical. Your report should show that the organization behaves predictably under stress. If your reporting is fuzzy, inconsistent, or missing key timestamps and approvals, it creates doubt, even if the technical response was strong. The goal here is to learn how to capture the right information during and after an incident so the report matches what auditors expect to see. The first thing to understand is that auditors generally do not start by asking whether you are perfect. They start by asking whether you are controlled. Controlled means your organization has defined processes, follows them, and records when it follows them. In an incident, that process might include how incidents are categorized, who is authorized to make decisions, how communication is approved, how evidence is handled, and how closure is determined. If your report reads like a diary of random actions, auditors will struggle to understand whether the organization is reliable. If your report reads like a structured account tied to roles, approvals, and evidence, it signals maturity even when the incident is messy. This is why compliance-ready reporting is not the same as long reporting. A long report can still be weak if it is full of guesses and missing decision context, while a shorter report can be strong if it is precise about what happened, what was decided, and what evidence supports those statements. Auditors also care deeply about scope, but not in the casual way people use that word in conversation. They want to know what systems, data types, and business processes were in scope for the incident and how you determined that scope. Early in an incident, scope is often uncertain, and that is acceptable, but the report must show how scope evolved as evidence was gathered. A compliance-ready report avoids jumping from initial suspicion to final conclusions without explaining what changed. It also avoids treating scope as only technical, because scope can include third parties, outsourced services, customer-facing functions, and internal operations. When auditors read scope, they are thinking about obligations, such as notification requirements, control commitments, and what parts of the organization's environment were covered by policy. Your job is to describe scope as a disciplined assessment, not a guess, and to document the evidence and reasoning that shaped the boundaries. A related concept that auditors look for is classification, meaning how the organization decides what kind of incident it is and what severity level applies. Classification matters because it triggers actions, such as who must be notified internally, how quickly response must proceed, and whether external notifications might be required. If the report does not show how classification occurred, it can look like the organization is making up rules on the fly. A good report explains what signals caused the incident to be declared, how severity was set, and whether those values changed as understanding improved. It also shows that classification decisions were made by appropriate roles rather than by whoever happened to notice the problem. Even if your organization's categories are simple, the act of documenting classification is valuable because it demonstrates repeatability. Auditors often view repeatability as a form of risk reduction because it means the response will not depend entirely on individual heroics. Timelines are one of the most audit-sensitive parts of incident reporting, and beginners often underestimate how much a timeline communicates about control. Auditors commonly look for time-based measures, such as time to detect, time to triage, time to contain, and time to recover, because those measures reflect whether monitoring and response are functioning. The report should anchor major milestones with clear timestamps and should distinguish between confirmed times and estimated times. Confirmed times might come from reliable logs, service monitoring records, or documented notifications, while estimated times might be inferred from evidence that is less precise. A compliance-ready report does not hide estimates. It labels them and explains why they are estimates. That honesty builds credibility because it shows you understand the limits of your evidence. A timeline should also include decision points, not just technical events, because auditors want to see that actions followed governance rather than impulse. Evidence handling is another area where auditors pay close attention because poor evidence handling can undermine every conclusion you claim. Even when an audit is not a legal investigation, auditors still want to see that evidence was preserved, protected, and handled in a way that reduces the chance of tampering or accidental loss. A compliance-ready report describes what evidence was collected, when it was collected, and who had access to it, and it shows that access was controlled. This is where the idea of chain of custody, COC, often appears in incident practices because it describes a record of who handled evidence and when. After that first mention, COC becomes a short way to refer to that discipline without repeating the full phrase. You do not need courtroom formality for most audits, but you do need enough documentation to demonstrate that your evidence is trustworthy. If evidence is not trustworthy, then your incident story becomes only a narrative, and auditors are trained to treat narratives cautiously. Auditors also expect that you can demonstrate adherence to internal policy, which means your report should connect actions taken to the organization's own rules. That does not mean quoting policies or drowning the report in policy language, but it does mean showing that the organization followed its defined process for escalation, communication approval, and decision authority. For example, if your policy says certain roles approve external notifications, the report should show when those approvals occurred and by what mechanism. If your policy says incidents are reviewed and closed with sign-off, the report should show the closure criteria and who confirmed them. This is less about pleasing an auditor and more about protecting the organization from confusion and disagreement later. When an incident is stressful, people may disagree about what should have happened, but a report that ties actions to policy gives the organization a clear basis for evaluation and improvement. Notification and communication records are another area where compliance-ready reporting makes a huge difference because many obligations are time-based and audience-based. Auditors may ask who was notified, when they were notified, and what was communicated, especially if the incident involved potential exposure of sensitive data. A strong report captures internal notification steps, such as when leadership was briefed and when key support teams were engaged, as well as external steps if they occurred. It also captures the rationale for why certain notifications did or did not happen, especially if the decision depended on evidence that was still being assessed. The report should show that messaging was controlled and consistent, rather than scattered and improvised. For beginners, the main point is that communication is an operational action, not a side conversation, and it belongs in the incident record with the same seriousness as containment and recovery. If you cannot prove what was communicated and when, you cannot reliably prove whether obligations were met. Compliance-ready reporting also needs to capture access and privilege decisions, because auditors frequently view identity and access control as a core risk area. During an incident, teams may disable accounts, reset credentials, tighten access rules, or elevate certain responders for investigation and recovery. These actions can be necessary, but they also create audit questions. Who authorized the changes? Were they logged? And were they rolled back or reviewed afterward? A good report does not need to include every low-level change, but it should capture major access-related actions and tie them to incident milestones. It should also describe how the organization ensured that emergency access did not become permanent access, because temporary decisions have a way of turning into long-term risk if they are not documented and reversed. Auditors look for evidence that exceptions are controlled, time-bound, and reviewed. Including this in your report demonstrates that urgency did not override governance. Another thing auditors often want is proof that the organization considered business impact and risk, not just technical cleanup. A compliance-ready report describes the impact in terms that connect to business operations, such as service availability, customer experience, financial cost, and operational disruption. It also describes residual risk, meaning what risk remains after recovery, because auditors care about whether the organization understands what is still uncertain or still vulnerable. For beginners, this can be tricky because it feels like predicting the future, but you can do it in a grounded way by describing what was remediated, what is planned, and what is still being evaluated. Residual risk language should be careful and evidence-based, not alarmist and not dismissive. Auditors want to see that the organization is not pretending everything is fine just because systems are back online. They also want to see that the organization is not exaggerating risk without evidence, because exaggeration can signal poor control of narrative. Corrective actions and lessons learned are also audit targets, because audits are not only about what happened, but also about what changed. A report that matters should not end with the final recovery step. It should show how the organization will reduce recurrence and improve response. Auditors often expect that corrective actions are specific, assigned, and tracked, because vague promises like improved security do not demonstrate control. Even without using a formal project system, the report can state what improvements will be made, what team is responsible, and what evidence will show that the change is complete, such as a policy update, a training update, or a technical control improvement. The report should connect these actions back to evidence from the incident, because that link proves the organization is learning from reality rather than guessing at improvements. For beginners, the key is to write corrective actions in a way that makes them testable, meaning a future reviewer can tell whether the organization actually did what it said it would do. Auditors may also examine whether your incident reporting supports broader control frameworks, even if they do not mention them by name. For example, your organization might be expected to show alignment with common practices that include monitoring, incident response planning, evidence handling, communication control, and post-incident improvement. You do not need to build your report around any one named framework to be compliance-ready, but the report should naturally contain the elements auditors associate with mature control environments. That includes clear ownership, clear timelines, evidence-based findings, documented decisions, controlled communications, and documented closure. If any of these elements are missing, the report can still exist, but it may not satisfy the auditor's need for proof. Compliance is often a question of demonstrability, meaning you can demonstrate you did what you said you do. The incident report is one of the main ways you demonstrate that under real conditions. A common misconception is that compliance-ready reporting means making the report sound legal, but legal-sounding language can actually reduce clarity and create new problems. Auditors appreciate clear, direct statements that separate facts from interpretations and that avoid emotional or speculative phrasing. Another misconception is that the report must include every detail to be defensible, but too much detail can bury the key evidence and make it harder to validate. The better approach is to include what is necessary to support conclusions and to show control, while keeping the report readable and logically organized. A third misconception is that compliance is only about external rules, when in reality auditors often focus heavily on internal commitments, like your own policies and promised practices. If your organization says it will do certain things in an incident, auditors will want evidence that those things happened. A compliance-ready report respects that reality by documenting the relationship between commitments and actions. Closure is the final audit-sensitive area to highlight, because auditors want to know when the incident ended, how the organization decided it ended, and what conditions were met before declaring closure. A report should describe closure criteria in practical terms, such as services restored, unauthorized access removed, monitoring in place, and key stakeholders informed. It should also capture final approvals and sign-offs, because closure without sign-off can look like someone simply got tired of the incident. Closure documentation should also include what follow-up work remains, because corrective actions often extend beyond closure, and auditors want to see that the organization is not confusing closure with completion of improvement. For beginners, the important idea is that closure is a governance moment, not just a technical moment. Documenting closure well protects the organization by showing that the incident ended intentionally, with awareness of what was done and what still needs to be done. The simplest way to think about compliance-ready incident reporting is that you are writing for someone who was not there and who will not accept confidence as proof. That reader wants to see evidence, timestamps, decision authority, controlled communication, and a coherent narrative that does not change depending on who tells it. They also want to see that the organization can learn and improve in a measurable way. When you capture what auditors expect, you are not doing extra work for outsiders. You are building an internal record that supports trust, accountability, and smarter response next time. The habits that make a report compliance-ready also make it more useful for your own teams, because clear documentation reduces repeated debates and reduces the need to reconstruct events months later. If you can consistently record classification, scope evolution, timelines, evidence handling with COC discipline, communication approvals, access decisions, corrective actions, and closure criteria, you will produce reports that stand up to scrutiny. That is what it means to deliver incident reporting that is ready for compliance review while still being practical, readable, and grounded in what actually happened.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.